Thanks, Karishma, for raising the bar now, and thank you, Creative Mornings, for having me over. I know it's tough to get out on a Sunday, and I'm very happy to see such a gathering. Uh, in terms of starting the session, I have a huge disclaimer that I have not discovered or rediscovered a 1,000-year-old water system in Hampi. This I was told that I had done by somebody on Facebook, and unfortunately I got the news very late because I'm not on Facebook either. So for those of you who think I have done that, that's not at all true. But there are other aspects that we will see. So yeah, in terms of rebel is a very, very loaded word, and I don't know if I will qualify as one because a lot of real rebels may take offense at something like that. But the idea is that you don't have to be comfortable doing what society expects you to do, or your profession expects you to do, or your immediate environment, or whatever. This is not necessarily to say you have to break rules in an anarchic fashion, like are some of the political statements that are going, but yet you can still make a lot of difference given the framework of engagement. It can be a very eclectic engagement depending on the kind of framework you come from. I see a lot of, and I presume a lot of you here today are design professionals of one sort or another. And to begin with, okay, what Karishma missed out was my original qualification, if you can call it that, is that of an architect. The disillusionment set in very, very fast from what we had studied to what was being done and how it is being actually implemented in society. Then I said we need to work on a larger scale. Then I studied landscape architecture, if that is the right word. And the disillusionment there did not take very long because we take many of these educations and professions in a very literal, immediate manner to say, okay, I'm an architect, let me do a building. I'm a landscape architect, let me do a garden. True, you may have to also do that, but one necessarily doesn't have to be limited to doing that. There is a whole gamut of things that are attendant to it. If you're looking at building, there is society, technology, livelihood. If you're looking at landscape, there is natural systems, cities, and a whole range of other issues that actually come together. Unfortunately, in the practice that we all have, the mainstream practice, if you can call it that, depending on how you define your own success, is it to build 500-man firm, is it to have a $100 million turnover, depends on how you define success. None of that is right or wrong. It's just that depending on how you define that success, then you can create the framework of what your scale of engagement or issues that you engage with. So what we are presenting here today is not really projects as it is conventionally understood, but the way you position these projects to understand larger issues. Sometimes you can engage with those larger issues in a positive way. Sometimes it can simply be a research or a generic understanding of the things, but yet to have this so-called academic way of looking at things when you look at methods and processes and the whole knowledge system that goes with it. Because like we have all been told a million times that your education doesn't stop the day you get your degree. But unfortunately, that is true for most of us, because after that, what you're engaging with is purely the breadwinning, mundane practice. So some of the works that we have been doing, mostly to do with sustainable development. That's a very icky word these days because everybody is sustainable. You have sustainable bankers, sustainable movies, sustainable auto rickshaw drivers, everybody is sustainable. But the idea is to understand what this means. Every engagement, every practice of yours, does it impact society negatively? Is it adding value? Adding value not necessarily in real estate terms alone, but in real terms of impacting people's lives. That does not mean that you have to give up commercial practice and open an NGO and donate money. That's not the idea. So you need to be able to straddle different aspects of this, and one such interest that we have always had in the works that we do is to do with natural systems, specifically to do with water. And water, of course, is a very topical issue. There's a whole lot of issues that discussions that centers around water conservation, rainwater harvesting, and stuff like that. But this is really looking at the tail end of the pipe. After you've had water, how do you conserve it? But where do you create water is what the challenge that we're looking at. And settlements that you, this will span a few scales back and forth, so my apologies to begin with. But the idea of understanding water and its engagement with human habitation also is embedded in how humans imagine their habitats to be. I mean, you have two very, very contrasting examples. You see the top one is Auroville, which is based on a very metaphysical plane of understanding the cosmos and how it relates to mankind, and the other one is a very efficient, modernist way of looking at settlements. We also know through history that there have been grand exercises of creating monumental cities, developments, which when they have not recognized the natural potential of that land, in this case Fatehpur Sikri is an example, thank God they didn't have reverse osmosis and Bisleri and Kinley water at that time. Otherwise the city would still be alive because they would be bottling in these water from God knows where. But the idea is that the entire settlement can no longer survive. You cannot ever create artificial systems that are continuously on us like an intravenous ICU patient which is continuously being fed with resources from an external system. So the idea of water, like I said, is now seen as only something that is to be supplied in an efficient, clean manner, in a cheap manner, of course, so that human civilization can continue to survive. And we have all kinds of, I don't have to be politically correct, stupid ideas floating around, including interlinking the rivers from the north to the south, or recreating river landscapes to suit our idea of either aesthetics or real estate or development or whatever else you define it. And this is what we end up creating. This is no prize for guessing. This is the latest intervention on the Sabarmati, where you recreate Berlin or Paris or London or whatever else is your imagined global city with no context, no understanding of geography or climate. I'm not even talking of people and culture and economics. Rivers are a part of a natural system. They get water from a larger hinterland, they behave in a certain way, they are dynamic systems, they are not meant as foregrounds for real estate. Yeah, so to understand what these mean also is to understand the larger issues involved. Like I said, water is not simply the tail end of the pipe, but the kind of ecosystem services that go on. These again are not terms I'm very happy with. We are just trying to create management terms to understand simple nature. Ecosystem services simply mean what environment has always done best, to provide livelihood, to provide nutrition, to provide clean living systems, and so on. But of course, now it helps that we will boil this all down to an economic model so that we understand how to value these things. So every time we're looking at any natural system, whether it is a little creek, a nala, a lake, a river, whatever it is, you have to understand that it is embedded in a much larger complex ecosystem. Even if you ignore the ecological and environmental aspect of it, how it is relevant only to human beings has a much more complex relationship than the simplistic debates that we have, for example, of whether should we bring in Kaveri into Bangalore or not, or how do we create rainwater harvesting in a terrace or not. So it's not simplistic pipe and solutions that one needs to look at. And it has its implication right across the spectrum of society. That includes food production, nutritional values, livelihood options, and so on. Yeah. So some of this understanding, at least for me personally, comes from trying to understand, trying to study what we call traditional knowledge systems. When I say traditional knowledge systems, it's again a fanciful word. It is what societies have always done, given their context of geography and climate, in their own limited manner. Now, one such engagement that we had is in Vijayanagara, Hampi, where a lot of work, for example, has gone into understanding, documenting, conserving, even recreating most of the built components, and rightly so. It's magnificent. If you have not been there, you should. So if we go through looking at Hampi or Vijayanagara or any of the erstwhile cities, for example, the built is very, very dominant in terms of our imagination. So when you say the Mughal Empire, you imagine a certain kind of a dome form or a certain kind of built form. If you look at Dravidian societies, you immediately relate it to a gopura or a temple or something. That's the immediate, more tangible imagination that we have. But our interest in understanding this was not simply the built. The built, of course, being very valuable, is how did such a huge metropolis survive in such a challenging climate? Now, in present day, it doesn't even look like a challenge. Okay, you create a dam here, you create pipe water services, and you're done. But when you actually look at traditional societies where there was no active energy, where resources of all nature, whether human or otherwise, were very limited, which means you had to make the best of what was available. So then you start looking at not just the built of how it is situated along the, let's say, the temple or the bazaar, but how is it embedded in the larger natural landscape. Because what's very interesting is that, okay, this is just a feel-good shot. That's my hand holding gold coins which were found excavated there. I didn't take them home, it's in the museum. But what's very, very interesting is to see how the city grew over a period of close to 1,000 years. And this was not something that was planned and built by one crazy monarch on a single day. It developed over centuries, which meant that whoever was building this was doing it in tandem with the natural environment. Now, even at the height of its power, what's very interesting to note is that even though it sits on a perennial river system, the city of Vijayanagara did not use the water of Tungabhadra for its domestic needs. One imagines that if it's a river-oriented civilization like we've always seen in history, you would simply use the river water for your domestic purpose. For various reasons, we can go into those philosophies later, but basically the river was more a spiritual foreground to create the city, which meant that the entire city, which at its height had a population of 600,000 people, which made it one of the largest agglomerations in the world of its time, survived exclusively on managing rainwater for all domestic needs, which means that you start looking at how the settlements sit. These diagrams actually tell you how you interpret the larger morphology, the larger landscape. How does it drain? Where is it draining into? And how are the settlements positioned in a particular manner? What's also very apparent is the best lands, the most fertile lands, the ones with the deepest soil cover, which in present day would be ideal for development, were actually not built upon. That remained agricultural even within the city. So the so-called wastelands, badlands, rocky areas, places with thin soil cover, they were the ones that were actually built upon, which means they are not productive enough. So it starts giving us a very different understanding of how do you even look at settlements. You don't just look at settlements on a two-dimensional plan and say, okay, here is the road, here is an area of flat land, let me build the city here. Because the long-term sustainability of settlements like this are based on not just the power of the king or trade, but also the livelihood of every person living in the city every day, which meant that unlike medieval cities that we imagine had this huge central node where all the palaces and the fancy stuff happened and it was created on a unipolar basis and things. Here you will actually see there is no single node. It's a series of settlements that are tied together by the landscape, which means each of these settlements that you see are pretty much independent of each other as far as water and food are concerned. All the darker patches that you see on these pictures are the fertile valleys where food production not only happens now, it continued to happen even when it was a metropolitan capital, which is very different from our imagination of cities, which is separate from the rural. You have the urban, you have the rural, which is a distinct divide. In this case, you see it is not. Yeah. So a lot of interpretation and studies were done to understand the geomorphology, the landscape systems, and drainage, and that led us to looking at how do you prove that what you are saying is right. Okay, one thing is to prove it on paper, but the other thing is to say how do you actually activate such a system. So like I said earlier, most of the conservation efforts remain on the build systems, protecting a bazaar, protecting a temple, and so on. Our interest was to see how do you actually revive a natural system in the way that it was done in the past. So a lot of the interpretations also meant that very, very small interventions on the site. None of these were pipe services. It was not like they were bringing water through an aqueduct or any such thing. It simply meant that understanding the geomorphology, like you see in the section below, meant that each of the hillsides had a specific ecological role to perform as far as the city was concerned, which meant they made little ditches on the top of a hill, a little trench on the edge of a hill, which meant it would hold the rainwater, and the entire hillside actually then starts working like a sponge. The idea is not to simply divert all the rainwater. In our imagination of rainwater harvesting is to say you catch the rainwater, put it into a tank and use it. The idea here is to say how do you actually strengthen the natural system, not work against it. Use the hillsides for what it was meant to be, which is a place for holding water in its soil, and use it in a gradual manner through the year, through open wells, pushkaranis, the temple tanks, and so on. So this is part of the physical conservation that happens in Hampi or most other archaeological sites that you would have seen. This is the temple tank as it was found. The dates are mentioned below. And typical conservation usually is limited to something like this, where you put it together. It's of course a very, very beautiful piece of urban landscape, but the idea is to see how did it actually work. So using all the studies that we had done, when I'm using the term we, it is not me or my office, it's the entire group of individuals and organizations that are working in places like this. It could be the Archaeological Survey of India, it could be many independent studies. Many of the studies that we are doing is also based on other academic interventions that have already happened. So it's not one man's recreation. So let me say that again and again. So, but the idea is based on something like this, which is an architectural conservation. You move beyond by activating the hillsides and the natural systems. And then after 1 year of doing this, you had 1 foot of standing water that percolated into this. This is not water diverted from the river or pumped in through a bore well or any such thing. This is natural activation of existing systems. And 2 years later, it becomes a stable system. And this is not, please remember that once it is done, it will remain like this forever. The reason this had died out is that landscape management had died out in the region. And only if you consistently keep doing that, it's the same as maintaining a pump or cleaning a pipe. It's the same as that, but now the actual provision of water is being done by natural systems, which means the same level of maintenance will need to go in to the larger landscape. Okay, having looked at something like that, immediately 2 things strike to say, okay, wow, all the people in the olden times and the ones who built empire were great people, let's all go back in 500 years, right? And that's the only way to live. Unfortunately, we don't have choices like that. We are living in large metropolitan areas. The idea is to say, how do you use some of this knowledge, the way they built cities embedded in natural landscapes, how do you use that in planning or even running existing settlements? So this is part of the study that we have been doing for many years. It continues to go on the Bangalore landscape. It's one of the few cities in the world, it actually sits very much away from any known water source. It's not on the side of a river or a large lake or a natural valley. In fact, it's on the top of a ridge, which means every drop of water that falls in the region of Bangalore actually drains completely away. But the nature of the landscape, the fact that the geomorphology is made of granite, that there are lots of valleys and hills and depressions, lends itself to creating hundreds, if not thousands of lakes. So, you know, the region of Bangalore is famous for having lakes. Folklore has it that there were 1,008 lakes which are connected. They are not simply lakes that you count, but that form part of a specific system. But when you start looking at the larger region of Bangalore, what is very apparent is we start looking at development plans made for Bangalore. These are all the, okay. So what you see here is, this is the metropolitan area, the built area of Bangalore, and this is the surrounding. The valley systems are actually moving away from the city in a radial pattern. But what our development plans do is we've put a nice green belt around it. A green belt was a great idea in 1890 when somebody dreamed up of this in England, but it has to be situation specific. You cannot just take a marker and draw a belt around it and say, here is your green belt. In fact, what the green belt has done is it has effectively fragmented and destroyed the natural systems. Because while the natural systems are actually radial, the green belt is in a circular form. It's actually working against each other. This is at the larger region, and if we actually go into looking at what causes this kind of an attitude is also you think with economic might and engineering might and all the other mights that modern man has, that you can actually work completely ignoring the natural systems, that I don't need the natural systems anymore. I have a river, I have electricity, let me just pump the water. The more you do that, it's a vicious circle. The more you rely on artificial systems, the more you ignore natural systems. The more you ignore them, the greater are their chances of dying. The faster the rate of death, the less you can rely on them. Hence your greater reliance on artificial systems. So it's one vicious cycle that loops into it. So right now we have assured water supply from only 100 kilometers away, 700 meters below our city level, which makes BWSSB, the authority that supplies water to us, the single largest user of energy in the state. It's not steel, it's not cement, it's not glass, any of these industries that use a lot of energy. Supplying water to us from here is the single largest user of energy. So in summer, when we run out of water in the city, funnily enough, it's not because the Kaveri is running dry. It's because there is no energy, because the energy producing station somewhere else is relying on hydroelectric energy, and those dams have run dry. So something that happens in the Western Ghats when there's no rain means that we don't get water in Bangalore because we are waiting for the electricity to come back to pump the water. So the more you start doing that, these are what happens to the embedded systems. In plan, we will of course say we are conserving the lake. We'll draw a nice belt around it and say, okay, protected lake, Lake Development Authority, beautiful garden, children's play area, whatever else we want to create around the lake. Except that the lake is dead. You just have a piece of real estate, because what sustains the lake is not this plan view we draw and say here is the lake, but the entire natural system that needs to support it. And that is no longer alive, or you're constantly eating into it. So the popular myth that, oh, lakes are dead because there are too many slums. The slums just come and take over lake beds, or some developer has taken it over, or whatever, is wrong, because you've got the process completely upside down. You first kill the natural system in the region, hence the lake is dead. Once the lake is dead, then people, informal users, slums, developers, they move in afterwards. Nobody is crazy enough to go and build their house in the middle of water. Only when it is dead do they take up that piece of real estate. So we have a very unique situation in Bangalore, where we have drinking water being provided from 100 kilometers away. But this nobody told to the weatherman, that we are bringing in water so you can stop raining now. We still get the same amount of rain we got 100 or 500 years ago, which means that all the water that would have actually got trapped in valleys and lakes now have no place to go, which is what causes flooding. Every time you even have a 10-minute shower, the roads are flooded. It's not because of climate change. It's not that rainfall has increased 500%, because we have killed all the areas which were the natural drainage patterns for these rainfall stormwater. So typically, when you look at only the aspect of water, and we are limiting the discussion to water, I'm sure there are 50 other dimensions we can bring into this. The impact is not simply on drinking water or solving the problem of Bangalore's drinking water. It is also to do with depleting groundwater, hence increased urban heat island, hence increase in the use of energy for air conditioning, which in turn increases the heat in the city. So it's again another vicious circle that goes on into it. So, okay, this is all very nice when you look at the larger thing. How do you actually use this? If suppose you were to do a campus, even a small campus of a 10-acre, 20-acre scale, there is a conventional way of doing planning, which is to draw the outline on a two-dimensional, saying, okay, here is 20,000 square meters. How much can I build on this? As architects, don't we all start from that premise to say, okay, here is 20,000, I'm allowed to build 40,000, so let me start from that premise. So to build that much, you start drawing the outline, which is to say you look at the floor space index, you look at land use, footprint, services. Services, in this case, including water, actually becomes something that you plug into the system in the end, not start with. But if you were to use a completely different way of looking at the problem, this is not to say do not build. If we had a choice, we will say don't build, but we know we have to build. But the same thing can be done by looking at land and its capacity. What is the capacity of that land? Not just to have buildings, to produce food, to produce water, to create habitat for biodiversity. It could be many different dimensions that the land has. then you look at how much is the minimum that you need to leave for nature, simply so that our own future is protected. You start from that, you can still, I can assure you, arrive at the same profitable matrix that you started with, which was 40,000 square meters of built area. But because these are the primary concerns now, they become embedded in the design. They are not retrofitted into the design later as you go on, which is, if you're looking at green buildings or any of the fanciful labels that you want to use, you actually decide what you want, you create the architecture, and then you say, okay, how do I make this environmentally friendly? Let me use soil cement blocks. Let me use some different kind of air conditioning system. Let me put dual piping for plumbing. These are all what you're doing is you're actually trying to reduce the impact of an immense problem you have created yourself. And so it would be much easier not to create the problem in the first place. Yeah. So looking at what we saw earlier with the same kind of a matrix at either a small or a larger scale, you can address many aspects of urban ecosystem, whether it is water, it's biodiversity, microclimate management, urban heat island, they all start becoming interrelated, even though till now we are only using one lens, which is of water. You can imagine the complexity if you start using multiple lenses on the same thing. You can use society, you can use livelihood, you can use economics, you can use many other lenses. Yeah. So again, as part of the demonstration, this was a semi-real project which was being done as a demonstration for one of the authorities to say, we know you have to develop this area. We are not saying don't develop it and give it away for conservation, but if you use these lenses that we talked about, how can you look at the landscape, the geomorphology, and ensure that it is a sustainable model that you're creating. So you no longer look at it as, I keep using the term two-dimensional real estate because that is what all sites have got reduced to. You are given a plan, most of the time there is not even a context, you don't know where the road is coming from, you don't know what the contours are, you don't know if there is a nala existing there. And if these features are put in, they're only put in as constraints. So say, oh, you can't build here, so let me work the setback around this line. Yeah, so, so we'll go quickly through this. This was a 3,000 acre kind of a scale as part of a real development that the Bangalore authorities wanted to do in one part of the city. So we use the same rationale of looking at the natural systems first. Why are we looking at natural systems? It's a very, very simple rationale. Whatever took the longest to create needs the most attention. Whatever can be created or destroyed in the shortest time needs the least attention. But in real planning and development, this is exactly reversed. What gets the most attention is where is the transformer coming, where is the water line coming from, what is the setback line. This determines the way you build, rather than looking at what is the land, what is the soil, what is the land capability that is available. Yeah. So looking at these things, you are actually able to create not just buildable areas, but what we call developable areas. Whatever is shown as green are not non-developed land. They are very much developed, they are simply not built on, which means like you would create specific land uses for built spaces, industrial, residential, and so on, you will also be able to do specific functions for open spaces. Is it productive? Is it productive for water? Is it productive for managing waste? Is it used for food production? It will have 50 aspects, any piece of open land. And you also then can relate it to densities. Where do you create densities? Densities are not created based on just imagined FSIs or where the nearest ring road is going. Those, like I said, can be even changed. Even if they exist, it's much easier to change the routing of a ring road than changing the entire geomorphology of the area. So you will still be able to create very tangible, very efficient and workable systems and spaces based on not just the urban aspect of the development, but the natural aspects that are embedded in that urban development. Yeah, next please. So these were land uses, these are all demonstration projects that was done to say there is no difference from a market model to this in terms of efficiency. It is simply that your starting points are not FSIs and ring roads and water mains, but it is the natural systems. Yeah, we can go through it. It can be taken to the last stage of understanding how open spaces will determine built mass, not just the density, but the kind of porosity in the architecture, the how the figure ground will start then relating to other aspects of land. Where would you put which function that has the most direct relationship to land and its productivity? Oh, now I'm a little scared to speak about this, seeing how many architects are there here, I'll get stoned, but this is the premise that most of us are forced to work with, which is to say, okay, here is this gold or platinum or silver medal that I want to win, and how do I start winning it? So here is this checklist of 80 things that I need to tick mark, okay? It's very sad. That's as nicely a word as I can use for this, because it's in complete contravention of anything that we understand on environment or sustainability. You create a monster to begin with, and then you say, okay, I'm going to clip your nails to make sure you don't do too much harm. You're still a monster. I know you can eat me up, but you know, let me do these little things so that I'm safe. It's quite ridiculous. Okay. Okay, so these was we looked at some grand historic projects which we can claim is how it works. We don't know if it is true or not. We looked at very large systems of how cities work and things. Again, we don't know if it's true or not, but it's important to see how the same learnings can be brought down to every scale. One argument can be like, okay, you can talk about all these fancy stuff, but all the projects that I do are these little campuses or little housing stuff that I do, I can't use any of this. That's not true. And this is a project which we have been, it's been active for close to 10 years now, and it continues to go on, is in a very challenging landscape near Amer in Rajasthan. The client in this case was the nicest client anybody can get. It was not human, which means they were a set of 150 elephants who had to be housed in this piece of land. Right now they live in roadside sheds made of asbestos and tin. They are used to ferry tourists up the fort. It's quite sad. But this team that they were working with, the animal rights group working with the elephant owners, had to create this habitat on this site. So of course, the only site available was what was considered the most useless. Obviously, you will not get the best site for a project like this. Something that no industry, no housing, nobody ever wanted, which was completely barren. What you see is from 10 years ago, which not a shred of vegetation on the site, completely eroded. And so what we did was, other than the programming was very important. I'm only talking about the ecological aspect, but equally the social and economic aspects were very important, because you're working with very poor people whose only livelihood is based on these elephants. So very ambitiously, what we set as a benchmark to ourselves was that this 100-acre piece of land with 150 elephants, which is a nightmare in any which way you look at, we will make it water sustainable. So what does making it water sustainable mean? For us, it means relying solely on the mercy of the rain gods, nobody else. It does not include digging deep bore wells. It does not include bringing in a pipe, dual piping, putting RO systems. None of these things come in, which was a pretty stupid challenge to set ourselves, knowing that this is a desert, right? But that's the way we work. So it doesn't also help that unlike humans who even a very comfortable lifestyle will demand something like 130 liters for all domestic uses, an elephant needs drinking water of 400 liters. It does not even include bathing and cleaning and all the other needs that you have, which itself is another dimension. So what we did was, based on the understanding of soil and slopes and stuff like that, we created this master plan that was, it was not enough to simply have a large tank and say, okay, here is this reservoir for drinking water, because it's not just enough to give, you can't drink, I mean, you can't make the elephants drink Kinley water in bottles, you will need 400 of those. But you also, you need many kinds of water systems for the elephants to survive. Elephants that have been living here get a lot of skin diseases, for example, because the climate is very dry. In their own natural habitat, they have mud pits, they spend a lot of time in water bodies and so on, because to keep the skin moist, which means that the water system that we had to create was not just for drinking water, but was to address all these biological needs of the elephant, which means even the kind of cross sections that are developed for these water bodies meant that there were areas where the elephant had to wade in very easily, have a nice time and get out. There were other areas where it was not allowed to enter, but which was the reserve water body that was created for harnessing water. Also the biodiversity, how much fodder do they eat, what kind of food do they eat, which of those can be grown in this climate in a natural manner, was another different set of challenges. So this was the final proposed master plan that was done. It is not being executed in one phase because it's dependent on public money, so it's slow going, but till now about 50 elephants have moved in, which is phase one of the development. And this was the land that we encountered 10 years ago, and the same land looks like this now. The water systems, the vegetation, again, these are not gardening and landscape exercises where I will put lawns and pretty looking trees. These are based on what is natural to that area. I should also understand that there should be a balance between how much water is allowed for the ecosystems for the land and how much water for the elephants, including, say, the kind of crops that are grown there or the kind of trees that can be grown. And in fact, what I forgot to mention is it's not just the elephants, it's not like a zoo. The mahouts, the people who live and work with the elephants, they and their families live with the elephants. They have a very specific social system, which means in addition to the 150 elephants, you will have about 500 humans living in this place. So that is what the place looks like now, and it's a great feeling to look at these elephants happy. The humans will never be happy, but at least the elephants are. I think we are done.